Early on Friday morning, Russia again launched its 10th air strikes this month, hitting many parts of Ukraine. During a press conference at the Kyiv Press Center on Friday afternoon, May 19, spokesman for the Ukrainian Air Force, Colonel Yuri Ihnat, said that airstrikes had sounded throughout Ukraine early Friday, with the area numbers then reported explosions. The warnings were extended to all regions of the country for about an hour from 2 a.m. local time. In the 10th attack this month, and the second in less than 24 hours, Russian forces have launched successive waves of drones towards the capital. This tactic by the Kremlin is an attempt to overwhelm our air defenses and put psychological pressure on civilians. They won't get what they want. Colonel Yuri Ihnat said. All air targets towards Kyiv were destroyed by our air defenses. According to Colonel Yuri Ihnat, the invaders launched 22 drones and 6 cruise missiles from the north and southeast. Air defense forces shot down 16 drones and 3 caliber cruise missiles. There has been damage in some regions of Ukraine. A 64-year-old woman was seriously injured. The Russian terrorist state is trying to exhaust the Ukrainian air defenses and the Ukrainian people, he said. 2. The U.S. signaled its allies that it would not stop them from exporting F-16 jets to Ukraine. The sources familiar with the discussions said the Biden administration had in recent weeks signaled to European allies that the United States would allow them to export F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. The move comes as the White House is facing growing pressure from members of Congress and its allies to help Ukraine by planes amid a growing Russian air raid. However, administration officials are unaware of any formal requests by any of the allies about exporting F-16s, and State Department officials, who are typically tasked with the paperwork. Papers to approve such third-party transfers were not required to commence work. Several European countries have supplies of US-made jets, including the Netherlands, which has signaled its readiness to export some of these planes to Ukraine. But the US would have to approve a third-party transfer because of sensitive US technology on the jets. While the US remains reluctant to send any of its F-16s to Kyiv, US officials told CNN the administration is willing to approve the jets' export to Ukraine if that's what allies want. Decide to do with their resources. Top Ukrainian officials have escalated their public lobbying campaign to buy US-made F-16s in recent months, arguing they need them urgently to defend against rocket attacks. Russian rockets and drones. The issue is expected to be the subject of debate at the next NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania in July, officials said. Another open question is where the Ukrainian pilots will be trained to fly these F-16s. A spokesman for British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said earlier this week that Britain and the Netherlands were looking to form an international alliance, not only to buy jets for Ukraine but also to train Ukrainian pilots. In March, the United States hosted 2 Ukrainian pilots at a military base in Tucson, Arizona, to gauge their skills using a flight simulator and gauge how much time they needed. Learn to fly U.S. military aircraft, including the F-16. But the U.S. currently has no plans to expand that training, a defense official told CNN, although Congress has already set aside money in the 2023 budget. 3. Russian troops continue to abandon a series of equipment in the city of Bakhmut. During a press conference at the Kyiv Press Center on Friday afternoon, May 19, Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar said the enemy continued to focus their main efforts on the Lyman, Bakhmut, Avdiivka and Mariinka directions. In the past 24 hours, 29 skirmishes took place in those 4 areas. The fiercest battles took place at Bakhmut and Mariinka. According to Deputy Minister Hanna Maliar, in the city of Bakhmut, Ukrainian troops captured strategic positions on the flanks and surrounded Wagner troops from the north of the city. Fighting was still raging as the defeat in the city of Bakhmut was seen as a great humiliation for the Russians. In the past 24 hours, 660 Russian soldiers have been eliminated from the battle along with 4 tanks, 4 armored vehicles, 12 artillery systems, 1 multiple launch rocket system, 1 air defense system, and 10 troop transport vehicles. And fuel. Overall, from February 24, 2022 to May 19, about 201,760 Russian invaders were eliminated from the battle. The invaders' losses also included 3,777 tanks, 7,377 armored vehicles, 3,210 artillery systems, 564 multiple launch missile systems, 319 air defense systems, 308 combat aircraft, 294 helicopters, 2,769 tactical and combat-grade drones, 1,011 cruise missiles, 18 warships, 6,083 troop and fuel transport vehicles, and 419 specialized equipment units. Fourth, the battle for Bakhmut is tilting towards Ukraine, and Russia knows it. Newsweek ran an article titled "The Battle for Bakhmut Swinging in Ukraine's Favor, and Russia Knows It," which means, the battle for Bakhmut is leaning toward Ukraine, and Russia knows it. We invite you and your brothers and sisters to follow the translation into Vietnamese through the presentation of Taiwan. Russia has acknowledged that Ukraine has regained much of its territory during the battle for Bakhmut, where Kiev's forces are believed to be advancing on the city's flanks in the Donetsk region. The Russian Defense Ministry said on Wednesday that its airborne forces had made small progress but acknowledged that Ukraine was continuing its counterattack near Bodanivka, 3 miles northwest of the city, and Ivanivsk, 4 miles to the west. The pro-Kremlin military analysis channel Rybar called on Russian forces to respond to Ukraine's actions. This implies that the forces of Moscow are losing the initiative in the Bakhmut area. Fighting battles are taking place on the flanks of Bakhmut, and both sides are pouring in more and more new forces. Unfortunately, we are in a position to play at the direction of the armed forces of Ukraine, pulling the most experienced units of the Russian forces into the Bakhmut meat grinder. However, the head of the Wagner mercenary group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, denied the claims of Russia's acquisition of Ukrainian territories and criticized the Russian Defense Ministry for wrongly describing a panic withdrawal as is the acquisition of new positions. Newsweek has reached out to the Russian Defense Ministry for comment. Colonel Serhiy Cherevatiy, a spokesman for the Eastern Ukraine Military Command, said that Ukrainian troops had advanced 500 meters towards Bakhmut in a day, liberating more Ukrainian land. Colonel Cherevatiy said Wednesday that while there is no advantage in equipment or personnel, we are beating them. In addition to conducting a successful defensive operation, we are also attacking from the flanks. On the same day, Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar said that the Ukrainian army held a 7.7 square mile area of land that had just been liberated on the outskirts of Bakhmut. Maliar also reports on Ukraine's advances in the region, although she acknowledges that Russian troops are still on the offensive inside the city of Bakhmut. According to the Institute for the Study of War, although Ukrainian forces have conducted successful counterattacks around Bakhmut, Russian forces may have stepped up their offensive efforts inside the city. The think tank said on Tuesday that this happened despite a broader effort to reprioritize operations to prepare for potential Ukrainian counterattacks. It comes as Ukraine says its air defenses have successfully shot down 29 Russian missiles, 2 kamikaze drones and 2 reconnaissance drones in an 8-hour strike from midnight, Wednesday to Thursday morning. Kiev was the main target of the attacks, according to Andriy Nebitov, Kiev Regional Police Chief. He said there were no significant damage or casualties. 5. Zelensky attended the Arab League meeting in Saudi Arabia and will be leaving for Japan for the G7 summit. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky attended a meeting of the Arab League in Saudi Arabia at the invitation of the Arab League. During the early days after Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the Arab League tried to maintain a neutral stance toward the war. However, transactions between Russia and Iran have raised concerns among countries in the region. Iran supplies Russia with shaded drones, and Russia in turn provides Iran with the equipment and expertise to expand its nuclear program and long-range missiles. The fact that the Arab League invited President Zelensky to a meeting for them may have chosen to take sides. Zelensky will then travel to the G7 meeting in Hiroshima, Japan from the Saudi city of Jeddah on a French government plane. Very important things will be decided there and therefore the presence of our president is absolutely necessary to protect our interests, said Alexei Danilov, Secretary of the Defense Council. And National Security of Ukraine, said. 6. Kissinger urges NATO to ignore Putin's threats. On May 25, 2022, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky launched a bombshell attack on former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who had suggested a day earlier that peace talks should be aimed at creating borders along the line of sight in the Donbass as it existed before the Russian invasion. Henry Kissinger often used speech patterns with complex syntax. In short, he means that Ukraine must make concessions, must give up land to Russia in order to have peace. Those who have some knowledge of modern Vietnamese history well understand this proposal of Henry Kissinger to Ukraine, which was also the proposal to kill South Vietnam in 1973. But, a year later in the wake of the Ukrainian victories, Kissinger said he had changed his mind. Newsweek ran an article titled "Kissinger Tells NATO to Ignore Putin's Threats," which means Kissinger urges NATO to ignore Putin's threats. We invite you and your brothers and sisters to follow the translation into Vietnamese through Thuy Con's presentation. Henry Kissinger, a former U.S. Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, said in an interview published on Thursday, May 18 that NATO should join Ukraine despite warnings from Russian President Vladimir Putin. Kissinger told The Economist, "For the safety of Europe, it would be better to let Ukraine into NATO." Putin has said that one of his goals at the start of the war in Ukraine was to prevent NATO expansion on Russia's borders. That goal backfired when Finland and Sweden were prompted by their invasion of Ukraine to join the military bloc of the North Atlantic Alliance. Putin is particularly opposed to Ukraine joining NATO. In the early weeks of the invasion in 2022, Ukraine and Russia are said to have discussed Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's pledge not to join NATO in exchange for a ceasefire, but that condition was dropped when peace talks stalled. Putin also said at a press conference shortly before the war started that Ukraine joining NATO could increase the likelihood of a Russia-NATO conflict that could turn into a nuclear war. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg has long been in favor of admitting Kyiv, although accession while still at war seems unlikely. Last month, he went as far as to say that Ukraine's rightful place is in the military alliance. Kissinger told The Economist, "In my view, what the Europeans are saying is extremely dangerous. Because the Europeans are saying, we don't want them to join NATO, because that's too risky. And so we will arm them and provide them with the most advanced weapons. How can that work? We should not end the war the wrong way," he continued. Assuming the outcome is that the above goal is achievable, it will be somewhere like the status quo before February 24, 2022. The result must be something in which Ukraine must be Europe protects, but cannot continue to be a single country taking care of itself. Newsweek has reached out to Kissinger via email for comment. Kissinger's comments to The Economist represent a reversal of direction from a statement he made last year. In a September discussion with the Council on Foreign Relations, he said he thought it is not a wise American policy to try to bring Ukraine into NATO. He softened that stance somewhat when speaking at the World Economic Forum's annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland in January. Kissinger said at the forum, "Before this war, I was against Ukraine becoming a member of NATO because I was afraid that would start exactly the process that we are witnessing today. However, the idea of a neutral Ukraine under these conditions no longer makes sense." In an interview with The Economist, the retired diplomat admitted that he had changed his mind, saying he was in a strange position where people say, he's changed his mind, now he's changed his mind. He supports Ukraine becoming a full member of NATO. Kissinger has also changed his stance on Ukraine and its territory. When speaking at the World Economic Forum last year, he said Zelensky should accept to give up the land to reach an immediate peace agreement with Putin. Now, he seems to feel that Russia will give up the conflict with little more than being able to keep Crimea. Still hostile to President Zelensky, Kissinger said, "We are now arming Ukraine to the point where it will become the country with the best weapons and the least strategic leadership experience in Europe. If the war ends the way it could, with Russia losing many of its interests, but keeping Sevastopol, the largest city in Crimea, then we could have an unhappy Russia. But there's also a disgruntled Ukraine, in other words, a balance of discontent," he said in his Economist interview. In another reference to Crimea, which Putin invaded and annexed in 2014, Kissinger said, "I want Russia to give up much of what it conquered in 2014, and my job is not negotiate a peace agreement." As for NATO, Kissinger said Russia would also benefit if Ukraine joined the bloc. "If I talk to Putin, I will tell him that he is also safer in NATO with Ukraine," he said. 7. Analysis: what the G7 meeting could mean for the war in Ukraine. This year's G7 meeting in Japan is special, not least because of its location. The leaders of the world's most advanced democracies are meeting in Hiroshima, the site of the world's first nuclear attack, a fitting reminder of the risks of nuclear war when they discussed Russia and the conflict in Ukraine. While many topics will be discussed, from countering Chinese influence in the region to the maximum level of U.S. government debt for public services, the war in Ukraine is likely to remain a topic. Top of the agenda. Kyiv's forces were greatly bolstered by weapons supplied by most of the countries centered on Hiroshima, the U.S., Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Canada and Japan. When Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, who is from Hiroshima, visited Kyiv in March, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky praised him for keeping the G7 united after Ukraine. Prime Minister Kishida announced that, as the chairman of the G7, Japan will maintain the unity of the G7 in imposing severe sanctions on Russia and supporting Ukraine, the joint statement said. The two leaders said. After a week in which Zelensky toured Italy, Germany, France, and Britain continuing to secure further aid pledges from many of these countries, Russia cannot expect any cracks in the unity of the Russian Federation. G7 at the summit. 8. A spokesman for the Kremlin said Moscow had frozen Finnish bank accounts in response to unfriendly acts. Moscow has decided to freeze the bank accounts of Finnish embassies and consulates in response to the country's unfriendly actions, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters. Member on Thursday. This is not an initiative of the Russian side. We are responding to a situation collectively created by the governments of several countries in the West, unfortunately, including Finland. We have always said that we cannot and will not tolerate unfriendly acts, he said. Bank accounts of the Embassy of Finland in Moscow and the Consulate General in St. Petersburg was frozen by the Russian government in late April, the Finnish Foreign Ministry in Helsinki told CNN on Wednesday. In a statement, the ministry added that it had required Russia to secure local currency and payment transactions of Finnish diplomatic missions. Finland is one of a number of European countries that have imposed sanctions on Russia since Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. The Baltic nation, which shares more than 1,000 kilometers or 621 miles of land border with Russia, has also sought to bolster its defenses against its neighbor by joining NATO in April. Russia's response shows that it can use economic weapons similar to those used by the West. But it's unclear if it plans to take similar actions against other countries or if it's attacking Finland alone. 9. Russia says the latest grain deal extension will be the last if the West doesn't lift sanctions. After agreeing to extend the grain initiative in the Black Sea again this week, Russia has again threatened to suspend the agreement if Western powers fail to meet demands for some sanctions relief. Russia has agreed to extend the deal by 2 months, until July 17. This is seen as pivotal to solving world hunger. Moscow frequently complains that while the deal allows Ukraine to export grain through the Black Sea ports, its own exports are hampered by Western sanctions. The Kremlin claims that an agreement with the United Nations to help facilitate Russian shipments has not yielded results. Russia's foreign ministry said on Thursday there would be no talks on extending the deal further unless Russia received concessions. The Russian Federation reminds the United States, the United Kingdom and the European Union of the need for the actual lifting of unilateral sanctions on Russian fertilizers and foodstuffs. Even Russian fertilizer donations to the poorest countries continue to be blocked due to sanctions, the ministry's statement read. The grain deal became necessary from the outset after Russia launched the war in Ukraine. After the full-scale invasion, Moscow blocked exports from the important Black Sea ports of Ukraine, including Odessa, Chornomorsk and Pivdeniye. The blockade prevented millions of tons of Ukrainian grain from reaching countries that depended on Ukrainian agricultural products, until the United Nations and Turkey helped broker the deal. Ukrainian ambassador to Turkey Vasil Bodnar said. What Russia is trying to attach now are issues related to the ammonia pipeline, issues related to the lifting of sanctions on banks and institutions involved in the grain and fertilizer trade. This issue is still being discussed, he said, adding that the grain initiative exists separately from the Russian requirements. 10. Global wheat prices fall as high grain deal is extended for 2 months. Global wheat prices fell sharply on Thursday after Ukraine and Russia agreed to extend an agreement to allow grain exports from Ukrainian ports in the Black Sea. Wheat on the Chicago Board of Trade fell 2% to $6.12 a bushel. Prices have fallen 23% since the start of the year and 57% since hitting an all-time high of $14.30 a bushel last March when Russia invaded Ukraine. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, told journalists on Wednesday, these agreements are important to global food security. Ukrainian and Russian products feed the world. The grain deal, first signed in July 2022, expired on Thursday, but Turkish, Russian and Ukrainian officials said on Wednesday it would be extended for another 2 months. Russia had previously threatened to withdraw from the agreement, complaining about a related deal with the United Nations aimed at facilitating Russian grain and fertilizer shipments. Why is this initiative important? Dear, Ukraine and Russia account for almost a third of global wheat exports, according to Grow Intelligence, an agricultural data company. They are also among the top 3 exporters of barley, corn, canola and sunflower oils. After a full-scale invasion of Ukraine last February, Moscow blocked important grain shipments from the country's Black Sea ports. That means millions of tons of the region's grain has not been shipped to many of the countries that depend on Ukraine's agricultural products. In the days following the invasion, global wheat prices skyrocketed, with the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization warning that up to 47 million people could be pushed into food insecurity. Seriously, because of the war. But the July cereal deal and its renewals have helped stabilize markets and reduce volatility, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, an intergovernmental body, said in a statement. A press release on Wednesday noted that global food prices have fallen 20% since reaching an all-time high in March 2022. 11. Intelligence Bulletin of the UK Department of Defence Intelligence. In the latest intelligence report, the UK Department of Defence Intelligence said the following. The Russian state has the ability to effectively ban senior officials from resigning while the special military operation continues. The measures could apply to at least regional leaders, security officials, and members of the powerful presidential administration. On the private front, many officials can be highly skeptical of war, as well as frequently experiencing job stress in the dysfunctional wartime apparatus. The ban is likely to be enforced with strong hints that those who resign will face criminal charges. Along with concerns about the capacity gaps that resignations will leave, authorities may also be trying to suppress any impressions associated with defeatism and promote a sense of responsibility. Collective for the war.